Heavy thunderstorms are pounding parts of Illinois, including the Chicago metro area this morning, and more flooding rains are affecting the state of Ohio and parts of West Virginia. More on that in just a second. First, though, a look at the tropics and the latest on weakening Hurricane Blas in the Pacific. Now with 75-mile-per-hour sustained winds, it's moving west, almost due west at 14. The pressure continues to come up as Blas is moving over colder and colder Pacific Ocean waters and will be dropping below hurricane status today. Otherwise, in the eastern Pacific, well, we'll be watching because this is a very climatologically favored region in June because there's very little shear in the upper levels of the atmosphere. The sea surface is very warm, and it is a prime area for development. So we would expect probably something else to organize down here in the eastern Pacific soon. We'll keep you posted. Now, on the Atlantic side, well, actually in the Gulf or the Caribbean, these are the climatologically favored areas for development, and as we head into July, we add the waters near the Bahamas and off the east coast of Florida, and also out here in the tropical South Atlantic from the Lesser Antilles on eastbound by several hundred miles. And the principal tracks, of course, as you can see, mainly off to the west-northwest. We still see a very slow start in the hurricane season, heading up the frequency of hurricanes and tropical storms rapidly in August, peaking out in September. Still some disturbed area, a disturbed area of weather in the Gulf of Mexico. And although development is not totally out of the question, we do not feel that really anything is going to organize at this time in the Gulf, because it is beginning to be affected by upper level low pressure in Mexico. And the more likely scenario is a continuation of some rainfall right along the Gulf Coast of Louisiana, along with gusty winds, but that's about it for the system in the Gulf. Caribbean's fairly quiet right now, some shearing winds out here. The intertropical convergence zone fairly active, but we're watching this little system, but if it were to head a little farther north, it would encounter those shearing winds in the atmosphere, so we do not feel development is likely there either anytime in the foreseeable future. So with that in mind, basically a very quiet tropical scene, except the hurricane in the Pacific, which is moving away from land. We come back to the lower 48, where thunderstorms again are rumbling from Virginia and West Virginia into Ohio. And there's been a tremendous cluster of storms overnight here from Minnesota, Wisconsin, into Michigan, southward into Kansas. One severe thunderstorm watch beginning to get carved away a bit by the Storm Prediction Center, while a new one has just been issued for southern Lake Michigan, southwest Michigan, and northern Indiana. This one is in effect until mid-morning this morning. Radar shows the storms moving through Chicago with strong winds and some small hail and heavy downpours. Other heavy storms, Ohio, down into West Virginia. There's some torrential flooding rainfall, frequent lightning, and small hail. Chicago, your warnings. Cook County, for instance, getting ready to expire here in just about 2 minutes. The storms again moving across the lakefront, probably now out into Lake Michigan and moving over into northwest sections of Indiana. Behind the storms, the winds will die down, and you'll have an hour or two of steady rainfall and cool temperatures across northern Illinois. And then late today, variable clouds and sunshine, and probably some more thunderstorm activity. Southeast Kansas City, storms are firing with frequent lightning, heavy rainfall, while in West Virginia here, just south of Parkersburg, and over in Ohio, more torrential rain. Now, fortunately, these thunderstorms are setting up in an area just south of where the most intense rainfall occurred yesterday, when we had all the major flooding right in here just north of I-70, north of Zanesville. But at any rate, Perry County has been under a warning. These storms settling south, Charleston, West Virginia, Beckley and Bluefield, and the Tidewater of Virginia. Pretty rough start to the day. In contrast, high pressure is moving down from Canada. What does that mean? It means after some morning clouds and fog in the northeast, the sun will come out, humidity drops, and no more rainfall today for upstate New York and northern New England, a place that was flooded out in some cases yesterday by some heavy downpours. 53 Caribou, 58 in Boston, 72 in D.C. for the warm spot. But it gets even warmer in the south, like mid-70s in Atlanta, mid-80s in Dallas, Fort Worth, hot, high.
Flood warnings continue in over a dozen counties in southeast Ohio into West Virginia. And from the National Weather Service, they're continuing the flood warnings until 4 p.m. Rain earlier this morning has caused a very serious flooding situation. Floodwaters continue to rise. And so National Weather Service says, and please use extreme caution in these areas. We'll check that out in a moment on Storm Watch. First, the tropics. And as we begin, we take a look at what's happening in the Gulf of Mexico. All eyes have been glued to the Gulf over the past couple of days as we've been watching a tropical disturbance drift its way northwestward. And here it's stalled out on the southeast coast of Texas. So when you get these tropical systems stalling out, they can really dump a lot of rain. And this area of concern is southeast Texas, where you see the yellows and the reds. These are the colder cloud tops with the thunderstorms and the showers in the vicinity. So it's easy to see who is getting the brunt of it this morning, right along the immediate Texas Gulf Coast. Here you can see the moisture, though, coming up into the Gulf, as indicated by this milky shade of gray in through here. So we'll be spawning more showers and downpours in these areas. But the hardest hit regions will be extreme southwest Louisiana into southeast Texas. Closing in, here's New Orleans. As you travel west to Baton Rouge and near Lafayette, we see a line of very heavy rain showers here, maybe some thunder and lightning too, where you see the yellows and the reds. This is where it's really pouring, and visibility will be greatly reduced. And with this rain coming down at the rate of over an inch an hour, could have some flooding of local roadways. In southeast Texas, the same scenario. Here we see that area of rain and thunderstorms just sitting here on the coast. We've had special marine advisories in effect here for the coastal waters of southeast Texas. Conditions are ripe for waterspouts. We've already had Doppler radar estimates of over 2-3 inches of rain in this area, and as you can see, it's still pouring. So once these tropical systems just kind of move in and just kind of sit here, you don't need an organized tropical system. Just a weak area of disturbed weather can really produce a tremendous amount of rain. And those of you in southeast Texas know what I mean. Some systems in the past have dropped ridiculous amounts of rain over a couple of days when they don't move, like 10, 20, 30 inches of rain. Not saying that's going to happen, but we've already seen some very heavy rains in this area here. You have the Doppler radar estimates, 2, 3, 4-inch type rains in southwest Louisiana, now pushing into southeast Texas. So this will be an area to watch, southeast Texas, with the very heavy rains near the coast. Beaumont, Galveston, places like that. So let's keep an eye on that one. Now as we take a look at the climatology for the end of June here, red shaded areas, places we look for possible development during the month of July right around the corner, we look farther out in the Atlantic. Of course, the yellow lines give us the movements of past storms that have developed in these areas. Looking into the Caribbean this morning, we see a southwesterly flow here. That's certainly not favorable for development. And farther out in the Atlantic, do see a tropical wave moving its way westward. Really nothing here to get too concerned about in the immediate future. And lastly, there's our area of disturbed weather pummeling extreme southeast Texas with very heavy rains. In the Pacific, Blas, still a hurricane, barely, 75 miles an hour, moving westerly at 15 away from land areas. There's Blas, well away from the coast of Mexico. And looking at the satellite picture here, well, Hurricane Center could see an eye briefly, but it looks like we've kind of lost that. So on the next advisory, Blas probably will be downgraded to a tropical storm. Closer to home, Saturday and Sunday, reports of high winds and large hail across the Midwest and in the deep South. Last night, winds gusted to 100 miles an hour in Erie, Illinois. Still the potential for more severe weather later today and tonight. So Chicago, you're not out of the woods. Could be some storms later. And down along a stationary front here, the Appalachians did see the flooding rains overnight here in southeast Ohio into West Virginia. Activity is dying down, but if we do see a redevelopment through here, that could make for more problems. Most active storms moving towards the Straits of Mackinac. In Columbus, all the heavy rain was just to your east this morning. You see some showers and storms move through. They have since weakened. And right here, southeast Ohio into West Virginia, that's where we have the problems with the flooding. And looking at the Doppler radar estimates of precipitation.
All right.
right, a busy night to cover storm watch for you. The tropics we'll deal with first and then get to the severe weather, which is breaking out in a big hurry across eastern Pennsylvania, and unfortunately in counties that have already encountered flooding as of last night. Let's go ahead and talk about the tropics first of all. The upper level winds showing our big ridge of high pressure over the Gulf of Mexico, then a trough to the east of that, and then another ridge. Interestingly enough, one of the long-range computer models actually breaks off a piece of this and sends it westward over the next several days. Now, I mean, we'll have to see how that plays out. But surely, with the kind of piece that it wants to break off and move over the warm waters of the Gulf, we could see some type of a middle-level circulation or maybe even low-level circulation accompany that if it in fact does occur. So that's something we'll watch for you. Other than that, as long as there's troughs here and these stronger winds on the south side mean very fair conditions across the eastern Caribbean and points east. The Bay of Campeche all the way up into the Gulf Coast looking good, even though there is quite a flare-up of storms out here. There's signs that there is a little mid-level cold pool sitting south of Lake Charles, a little mid-level circulation here, but nothing that we think is going to develop in anything anytime soon. There's been some heavier rain along the Gulf Coast today and just offshore, so not exactly the perfect boating day, even though tonight around Houston it's really not doing too bad. We take you farther east. Again, look at the islands today, a few high clouds, a little jet cirrus there, and our usual intertropical convergence zone thunderstorms, and another impressive wave. Look at this wave coming off the African coast. You know, huge deep convection, and all of a sudden it hits this cooler water, and see you later. And of course the upper level wind's not favorable in this region either. Now if you talk to me and it's late July or even into August 10th or so, I would be a little bit more impressed with this wave, but right now I'm not too impressed, especially given the climatology, which is what we're going to talk about. June, these are the areas that we look to develop. We've seen this graphic before. Of course, we're in the Gulf, we're in the northwestern Caribbean. But in July, sometimes these waves are potent enough that come off the African coast. And with a feature like we have today, that trough over the Caribbean, and then a ridge to the east of that, sometimes these waves can develop east of the islands. Early on in July is typically a very quiet time. If you go back to 1896, there have only been 20 storms through 1997 that have developed in this favored zone. So early July is one of your quieter times, believe it or not, in the tropics. Usually. All right, here's Blas, tropical storm Blas now, 18.0 north, 122.6 west, 880 miles to south-southwest, west-southwest of Cabo San Lucas. Winds are at 60. It's moving west at 13. Estimated pressures at 984. Earlier on today, Blas had an eye, and that's why it was still a hurricane this morning, but it has since weakened considerably as it moves over water where the temperature is about 72 or 73 degrees Fahrenheit. And as you know, we need about 80 to 85 to really get this thing cranking. So there's Blas as we wave goodbye. Once a Category 4, responsible for some pretty nasty surf from Cabo Corrientes all the way up to Cabo San Lucas, and they didn't really have to hold any of the larger ships at bay around Acapulco, but still, when a strong hurricane like that develops as soon as it did, close to Mexico, sometimes the swells and the waves tend to keep at least the bigger ships in bay. It kept the smaller ones in, but even the bigger ones can stay at bay. Notice our thunderstorm forecast as we get into tonight. A couple of areas we're watching already with a severe thunderstorm watch. Western PA on across north-central Ohio. This is an area where a front lies, plus this incredibly juicy air with dew points in this entire region well over 75, and in some cases well over 77, which is tremendous juice. Let's start on the west end. Not much around Omaha yet, but a few storms trying to fire here and actually build west when they do into southeast Nebraska. Here's a look at Iowa. Showers and storms trying to fire, and when they do, they are going to go up in a hurry. Like, for example, these ones in northern Missouri. Keep an eye on those. They look like they're growing pretty well. The main moisture convergence is actually south of Chicago tonight. So this could be good news. The biggest storms may actually fire to your south Chicago. We'll have to wait and see. But the problems have already occurred. There are warnings out for all these cells west of Cleveland, and even these now as they begin to develop south of Cleveland and down in Guernsey County, which is where they've had major flooding problems.
Storm Watch. I'm Bob Stokes. Thanks so much for joining us on this Sunday evening. Well, we do have some storminess and some flooding to talk about in the Ohio Valley. We'll detail it for you in just a moment. But first, let's find out what's going on in the tropics, and we'll update you on what is now Tropical Storm Blas. First, we start off with a look at the Caribbean and the upper level winds, as well as the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Basin. It's been quite inactive so far this year, and it remains that way tonight. We don't see any development going forward over the next 24 hours at least. Now, the tropical disturbance that we thought might have a shot at some momentum was torn apart by some upper level winds around an upper level low. But right now there are no favorable developments going on right now. You can see the winds generally this way, and generally an easterly component to the winds from west to east across the Atlantic, but no development now. What you see is convection over land. That's the remnants of a disturbance that has brought, of course, copious amounts of rain to Louisiana, western Louisiana, and is now affecting Houston with thunderstorms and heavy amounts of rain. Look at this just tropical plume right here, and that's continuing to feed right into the Gulf Coast of Texas, so that's posing travel problems. But as far as the actual Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean, I mean, there's just there's no organization, nothing to worry about in the next 24 hours as we see it now in terms of any tropical development. A lot of convection going on over land, over Mexico, that's for sure. There's a look at that moisture coming right into Houston. Again, it's a messy night. We've seen heavy rainfall. Because it's coming from the tropics, I mean, you can't wring this moisture out like you can out of a cloud or out of a thunderstorm that lasts for, 60 minutes or so. I mean, this just continues to feed in. So you've got rain overnight in your forecast and more flooding potential here. And we've seen since 8 o'clock this morning up to 4, 5, 6 inches of rainfall in some locales in Louisiana and getting into Texas. So we've seen tremendous amounts of rain. You're probably very familiar with it living in this area. It's just a washout for many of you, unfortunately. So don't try to negotiate those low dips in the road. You don't know how heavy that water can be. Let's take a journey now to the Atlantic. Again, you see some convection here and there. It's hot. The waters are plenty warm. We just don't have any twists and turns, any major seedlings, any disturbances to work with here. So nothing going on right now in the Atlantic. Yeah, we've seen these storms tumbling off of the west coast of Africa. It's not until about a month or two from now that we really see these waves or these disturbances, these areas of convection gaining chances, at least high chances of making it all the way across the Atlantic. But generally for June, these are the origins and principal tracks of tropical storms and hurricanes. June being a fairly inactive month as far as hurricane season is concerned. Of course, anything can happen. We see named storms perhaps once every other 2 years on average, every other year, let me put it that way. And this is a good time to prepare. If you live in a area, get your emergency kit together, etc. Make sure those batteries, you have those where you can get them into your flashlight. You know where things are. Get those ready now if you live in a hurricane-prone area, because it becomes much more active in July. These are the origins and principal tracks of tropical storms. We increase the number of tracks and increase the areas of origin in July. In fact, July 1st through 10th, we've had 20 storms from 1886 to 1997. This is where they've originated, right here. So if you live in any of these areas, know this is what's coming up. You've got your chances right here, July the 1st through the 10th. So please be prepared. Let's go now to the eastern Pacific, to Tropical Storm Blas. You can see it's a tropical storm with winds of 60 miles per hour around the center of circulation, moving to the west at 12 miles per hour, and is expected to continue to weaken as it moves out over colder waters. You can see that the cloud tops are not that high at all. It's still got some identity here, that's for sure, but it's long since past the hurricane stage. There's a look at some convection to the south here that bears watching. We'll keep an eye on this convection to see, and this convection, because it's in an area where we've had development before this season, so we'll just keep an eye on this. But our concern